She walked down the aisle toward a man who had already decided to destroy her. Graham didn't marry Abby out of love. He married her out of revenge. Cold, calculated, deliberate. But no plan survives the moment you look at someone and realize they've become the only thing you can't afford to lose. What do you do when the person you chose to ruin ruins you first, by making you feel something real? If your heart just skipped, subscribe, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now take a breath, because what comes next will leave you speechless.
Hello, Marcus here. If you like intense stories, then this one is for you.
Chapter 1.
The rooftop of the Meridian was the kind of place that made people believe in forever. Chicago stretched below like a living painting, 1,000 lights blinking against the November sky, the wind carrying the faint scent of winter and possibility. White orchids lined every surface. Candles burned inside hand-blown glass globes. A string quartet played something achingly beautiful near the bar, and the guests stood in clusters of silk and tailored suits, champagne in hand, murmuring the way people do when they're watching something that looks exactly like happiness. Abby noticed none of it. She was watching Graham. He stood at the end of the aisle, if you could call it that, a narrow path between rows of white chairs on a rooftop in the sky, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been designed specifically for the architecture of his body. Dark hair, sharp jaw, the kind of stillness that made a room reorganize itself around him.
I give you this ring as a
wasn't
sign of
smiling,
my love.
but he was looking at her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs before she could think to protect it. She had always been drawn to quiet men. Men who carried depth the way oceans do, silently, vastly, with a suggestion of something extraordinary beneath the surface. Graham Cole was the quietest man she had ever met, and she had mistaken that silence for mystery, for restraint, for the particular kind of love that doesn't need to announce itself. Her father squeezed her arm as they reached the end of the aisle. "You look beautiful," he whispered. She turned to smile at him, and when she looked back, Graham's eyes were already waiting. Dark, steady, unreadable. The ceremony was elegant and brief. The officiant spoke about commitment and courage, and the choice two people make to build something together. Abby listened to every word. She felt them land in her chest like small stones dropped into still water, each one creating ripples she would carry for years. When Graham took her hand to slide the ring onto her finger, his touch was precise, deliberate. Not the trembling hands of a man overwhelmed by love, but the controlled, careful movement of someone executing something they had planned a long time ago. The platinum band settled against her skin, cool and perfect. She looked up at him. His expression hadn't changed. Those dark eyes held hers, and she searched them the way you search a sky before a storm, looking for signs, for warmth, for something that tells you whether to open an umbrella or lift your face toward the rain. What she found, she told herself, was emotion contained, depth restrained. He was a man who kept everything close to the chest. She had known that from the beginning. On their third date, he had talked about architecture for 40 minutes and then gone completely silent when she asked him what made him happy. She had found that fascinating. She had found it romantic. He feels everything, she had told her best friend Maya 2 months into dating him. He just doesn't know how to let it out yet. Maya had tilted her head in that careful way she had. Or maybe, she said softly, he's just not letting it out for you. Abby had dismissed that. She was good at dismissing things that complicated the story she wanted to believe. Now, with his ring on her finger and his eyes on her face, she dismissed it again. The reception bloomed around them, music, laughter, the warm amber glow of 100 candles catching on crystal glasses. Graham moved through the evening with the same composed ease he brought to everything. He shook hands, made brief conversation, accepted congratulations with a nod and a half-smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was present the way a painting on a wall is present. Visible, beautiful, impossible to touch. Abby danced with her father, then Maya, then her college roommate who cried through the entire song. When she finally looked for her husband, the word still strange and luminous, she found him across the room, standing near the edge of the rooftop, a glass of whiskey in his hand, looking out at the city below. She crossed the space between them and stood beside him. The wind moved through her hair, carrying the faint scent of his cologne, cedar, and something darker, something she didn't have a name for yet. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He turned to look at her. A beat passed. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and complicated, like a door opening and closing before she could see what was inside. "The city," he said. She nodded slowly, leaning her forearms on the railing. Below them, Chicago breathed and hummed, indifferent to the two people watching it from above. She felt the distance between their arms, 2 inches, maybe 3, and wondered if she should close it. She wondered if he would. He didn't. But when a gust of wind pushed her hair across her face, and she reached up to pull it back, his hand was there first, one brief, unhurried touch, fingertips brushing her cheekbone as he tucked the strand behind her ear. He pulled his hand back immediately, looked away. Abby pressed her fingers against the railing and said nothing, but something had shifted in her chest, quiet and significant, the way a key turns in a lock you didn't know was there. She just didn't know, not yet, which side of the door she was standing on.
Chapter 2.
The apartment was extraordinary in the way that certain beautiful things are. Cold at the center. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago skyline, the kind of view that made visitors go quiet the moment they stepped inside. The furniture was all clean lines and expensive restraint, cream sofas, dark wood surfaces, shelves of architecture books arranged with geometric precision. Everything in its place, everything considered, nothing accidental. Abby had moved her things in on a Tuesday, and by Friday she understood something she couldn't yet articulate. The apartment didn't feel like a home someone lived in. It felt like a space someone had designed to keep the world at a specific, manageable distance. She was beginning to suspect that included her. The first week she told herself it was adjustment. 2 people learning the rhythm of shared space. Who takes the bathroom first, who makes the coffee, where the silences are comfortable and where they press. She had lived alone for 4 years. He had lived alone for longer. It made sense that there would be friction, or at least an awkward tenderness, a fumbling toward each other that would eventually smooth itself out. But Graham didn't fumble. Graham didn't do anything by accident. He woke at 6, ran 5 miles, showered, and was seated at his laptop with coffee before she had finished getting dressed. He came home between 7 and 8, ate whatever she had made or ordered without complaint, asked her 2 or 3 careful questions about her day, the kind that demonstrated attention without requiring vulnerability, and then retreated to his home office until well past 10. He was never unkind. He was never distant in the way that announces itself with coldness or sharp edges. He was distant the way a glass wall is distant, smooth, transparent, and completely impossible to cross. On the 9th day, she made dinner, not ordered, not assembled, made. She spent 3 hours on it, a slow-braised short rib recipe from the restaurant where they'd had their second date, roasted vegetables, a bottle of the Barolo he had ordered that night. She set the table properly, lit 2 candles, put on something low and warm through the apartment speakers. When Graham walked in and saw it, he stopped in the doorway. Something shifted in his expression, brief and unguarded, gone before she could read it clearly. "You cooked," he said. "I did." She kept her voice easy, unbothered. "Sit down." He sat. He tasted the food and told her it was excellent, which it was. He poured the wine and asked about the project she was working on at the design firm, and she talked about it. And he listened with that focused attention he gave everything, the kind that made you feel briefly, brilliantly seen. Then she asked carefully, "What was your childhood like?" The air in the room changed. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't flinch or go rigid. He simply redirected. Smoothly, almost imperceptibly, the way a river moves around a stone. So naturally you almost don't notice the stone is there at all. "Structured," he said. "My father was particular about routines." He reached for his wine. "Did you always want to go into design, or was that something that came later?" Abby looked at him across the candlelight. She kept her expression soft, her voice even, but inside, she was cataloguing, filing. A woman who had grown up watching her father navigate boardrooms and power plays had learned early to recognize deflection dressed as conversation. She answered his question. She let him steer. But she didn't forget where the stone was. After dinner, she made coffee, one for herself, one for him, the way she'd learned he took it, black with half a spoon of sugar, and carried both mugs to the kitchen island where he was scrolling through something on his phone. She set his mug down. Her fingers released the handle at the exact moment his reached for it, and for one suspended second, their hands occupied the same warm ceramic, her fingertips resting lightly against his knuckles. She started to pull away. He didn't move. It lasted barely 2 seconds, maybe 3. But Graham Cole, who moved through every moment of every day with the precision of someone who had choreographed his own life, did not move his hand. He looked down at the mug. Then he looked up at her. His eyes were very dark in the kitchen light. His expression was unreadable in the way that had started to feel less like mystery and more like a language she hadn't been given the key to. Then he picked up the mug, turned back to his phone and said, "Thank you for dinner. It was really good." Abby wrapped both hands around her own mug and walked to the window. Below, Chicago moved in its relentless electric way, taxis and headlights and people who had somewhere urgent to be. She pressed her shoulder lightly against the cold glass and watched the city breathe. 2 seconds, maybe 3. She didn't know what it meant. She wasn't even sure it meant anything, but her pulse hadn't returned to normal yet, and the coffee in her hands had nothing to do with why she was warm.
Chapter 3.
She wasn't supposed to be home. The Whitmore project had consumed her entire week. Late nights at the firm, early mornings with coffee going cold beside her keyboard, and when her Thursday afternoon meeting cancelled without warning, she felt the gift of unexpected hours open before her like something rare and undeserved. She texted Graham out of habit, got no response, assumed he was in back-to-back meetings the way he always was on Thursdays, and took a car home. The apartment was quiet when she walked in. She dropped her bag on the entryway table, slipped off her heels, and was halfway to the kitchen when she heard his voice, low, careful. Coming from the direction of his office, the door slightly ajar. She wasn't trying to listen. She was simply there in the hallway in her bare feet, holding her shoes in one hand. "The quarterly numbers are solid," Graham was saying. "Hartwell won't see it coming until the board meeting. By then, it'll be too late to restructure." A pause. Someone on the other end of the call speaking. Then Graham's voice again, quieter now, with an edge she had never heard before. Something beneath the composure, something old and sharp. His daughter being in the picture complicates nothing. She was always part of it. Marrying her was the cleanest way to get access to the Hartwell legacy holdings without triggering a hostile review. By the time the dust settles, he'll have nothing left to protect. The shoes fell from Abby's hand. She didn't hear the rest. The words dissolved into a high, thin ringing that filled her ears and pushed everything else out. She stood completely still in the hallway, the cool hardwood under her bare feet, the faint smell of his coffee drifting from behind the cracked door, the afternoon light cutting clean white lines across the floor, and felt the world she had been carefully, lovingly constructing collapse in real time. His daughter being in the picture complicates nothing. She was the daughter. She had always been the piece, not the person. The piece. A clean, elegant solution to a problem she hadn't known existed. She moved to the bedroom without making a sound. She wasn't sure how. Her body seemed to be operating independently of the rest of her, carrying her forward on instinct, while everything behind her eyes went white and still. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. At some point, she moved to the bathroom. She sat on the cold marble floor with her back against the wall and looked at her left hand, at the platinum band catching the light, at the elegant simplicity of it, at how beautiful it had looked when he slid it on with those careful, deliberate hands. The cleanest way. She pressed her back harder against the wall. She didn't cry. The feeling was too large for tears. It was the kind of pain that sits in the sternum and vibrates at a frequency too low to release itself through something as simple as weeping. It was the pain of a story rewriting itself backward, every moment recalibrating. Every soft thing she had catalogued, his hand on the mug, his fingertips brushing her cheek in the wind, the almost warmth of Thursday dinners, rearranging itself into something that had never meant what she had needed it to mean. She sat there until the light through the small bathroom window shifted from afternoon gold to the flat grey of early evening. Then she stood up. She washed her face. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long, unblinking moment. At the woman looking back at her, clear-eyed and straight-spined, cheeks still flushed with the specific heat of humiliation. She had her mother's jaw, her father's stubbornness, and something that was entirely her own, a quiet, unbending refusal to become a casualty of someone else's story. She was not going to run. Running would give him exactly what he had planned for: a clean exit, a scared woman, A transaction completed without friction. She had been placed on this board like a pawn. But pawns, she knew, were the only pieces on the board that could become something else entirely if they were brave enough to keep moving forward. She straightened the collar of her blouse, put the earring back in that had come loose at some point without her noticing, smoothed her hair. When she walked out of the bathroom, Graham was in the kitchen, his back to her, pouring himself a glass of water. He was still in his work clothes, sleeves rolled to the forearm, collar open at the top button. He looked, as he always did, completely composed, completely contained. "You're home early," he said, turning. If he noticed anything different in her face, he didn't show it. "Meeting cancelled," she said. Her voice came out smooth, even, entirely her own. He nodded and looked back at his glass. "Hungry? I was thinking about ordering from that Italian place on Erie." "Sure," she said. She moved to the counter, picked up her phone and stood beside him in the kitchen, as though the floor beneath her hadn't just opened and swallowed everything whole. She had made her decision. She was staying, and she was going to make Graham Cole feel every single centimetre of what he had so carefully planned against her. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with something far more disorienting. Herself.
Chapter 4.
Graham had prepared for every possible reaction. He had run the variables the way he ran everything, methodically, without sentiment, accounting for the range of human responses to betrayal when it finally surfaces. Tears were the most likely outcome. Confrontation was a close second. A dramatic exit, a slammed door, the particular kind of wounded fury that announces itself with raised voices and thrown accusations. All of it had been factored in, filed, assigned a response protocol. What he had not prepared for was this. Abby at breakfast, in a cream silk blouse and tailored charcoal trousers, scrolling through her phone with the focused calm of someone who had absolutely nowhere better to be and no interest whatsoever in the man sitting across from her. She had been like this for 4 days, not cold. Coldness would have been something. Coldness has texture, has heat underneath it, has the shape of something that used to be warm. What Abby was doing was more precise than coldness. She was courteous, impeccably, surgically courteous. She passed him the coffee without being asked. She responded to his questions with complete, considered answers. She laughed at appropriate moments during the work dinner they attended Tuesday evening, charmed every person in the room, and managed to spend 4 hours beside him without once directing at him anything that could be described as genuine attention. She looked through him the way you look through a window, registering the glass, not seeing it. It was, without question, the most unsettling thing anyone had ever done to him. He found himself doing something he hadn't anticipated. Watching her. Not strategically, not analytically. Watching her the way you watch something you don't quite understand and can't stop trying to. The way she tucked one foot beneath her on the sofa when she read. The way she held her coffee mug with both hands, even when it was no longer hot. The small private smile that crossed her face sometimes when she was looking at her phone, there and gone before it could be examined. On Wednesday evening, he came home to find her on a video call at the kitchen island, laughing, genuinely laughing. Not the polished social laugh he'd heard at client dinners, but something unguarded and bright, her head tilting back slightly. She held up one finger in his direction without looking at him, still laughing at whatever Maya had said, and something about that single gesture, the casual assumption that he would simply wait, landed somewhere in his chest with unexpected weight. He made himself a drink and waited. He told himself it was patience. He was good at patience. He had spent years being patient. Thursday brought a client lunch she mentioned the night before. She wore a fitted deep burgundy dress and low heels that made a clean, decisive sound on the hardwood as she moved through the apartment, and Graham, seated at his desk, with a quarterly report open on his screen, found himself reading the same paragraph 4 consecutive times. When she passed the office doorway, she paused. "The Brennan file you were looking for is on the kitchen counter," she said. "It was under the mail." He looked up. "Thank you." She nodded once and left. The sound of her heels faded down the hallway, and the apartment settled back into its usual silence. He looked at the quarterly report. The words meant nothing. He closed the laptop. The plan had been clean and elegant in its conception: marry the Hartwell daughter, gain access to the legacy holdings before Richard Hartwell could restructure his assets, allow the board meeting to do the rest. Abby had been a variable, not a consideration. A means, not a person. He had told himself that long enough, and with enough conviction that it had calcified into something resembling fact. But variables, he was discovering, had a way of refusing to stay variable when you were forced to share a kitchen with them every morning. She wasn't what he'd expected. He had expected softness without spine, warmth without intelligence, the kind of woman whose feelings made her manageable. What he found instead was someone who read contract law for leisure, who had strong opinions about urban architecture that she delivered without apology, who could make an entire room lean toward her at a dinner party without appearing to try, and who could, apparently, look directly at him with those clear, composed eyes and make him feel like the one who had something to explain. Friday evening, he arrived home to find her on the balcony, a glass of white wine in hand, looking out at the city. She hadn't heard him come in. The wind moved through her hair, and she reached up absently to push it back, and the gesture was so unself-conscious, so entirely unperformed, that Graham stopped in the middle of the living room and simply stood there. She turned, registered him, and raised her glass slightly in acknowledgement before turning back to the view. 1 degree warmer than nothing, precisely calibrated. He walked to the kitchen, poured himself a drink he didn't particularly want, and stood at the counter staring at nothing, while something he had no immediate category for settled heavily in the center of his chest. She wasn't falling apart, she wasn't fighting him. She was simply herself, fully, quietly, immovably herself. And for the first time since this had all begun, Graham Cole felt something shift beneath the architecture of his certainty. He just wasn't ready to name it yet.
Chapter 5.
The dinner was at 16, on the 16th floor of the Trump International, with a view of the Chicago River that made the city look like it had been designed specifically to impress. Richard Calloway, senior partner at Calloway Mercer, one of Graham's longest-standing business relationships, had reserved the private dining room for 8 people, the kind of evening where every detail was considered, where conversation moved between deal structures and vacation properties and the particular brand of casual power that men like Calloway wore the way others wore watches. Graham had told Abby about it 3 days in advance. She had nodded, checked something on her phone, and said she would be ready at 7. She was ready at 6:55. She wore a black dress that was neither revealing nor forgettable, structured at the shoulder, fitted through the body, the kind of thing that suggested she had excellent taste and no interest in proving it. A single gold bracelet on her left wrist, hair up, with the kind of effortless precision that takes considerable effort. When she appeared in the living room doorway and Graham looked up from his phone, he held his gaze on her for exactly 1 second longer than necessary before standing. "Ready," he said. "Yes," she agreed, and picked up her clutch. In the car, she looked out the window. He looked at his phone. The silence between them was their usual silence, but it had a different density lately, like air before lightning. At the restaurant, something happened that Graham had not accounted for. Abby was extraordinary. Not in the way she was extraordinary at home, quietly and privately, but in the way that a room responds to a person who has decided, fully and without apology, to inhabit it. She remembered names after one introduction. She asked Richard Calloway about his daughter's architecture program in Barcelona, and the way his face opened told Graham that no one had asked him about it all evening. She held her own in a conversation about municipal development policy with a man who had spent 30 years in city planning, and when she disagreed with him, gently, precisely, with a smile that made the disagreement feel like a gift, the man laughed and said she was absolutely right. Graham sat beside her and watched it happen. She did not look at him once, not with hostility, not with performance. It was something more surgical. She was simply completely present for everyone else in the room, and he existed in her peripheral vision the way the centerpiece existed. Noted. Unremarkable. Furniture. Calloway leaned toward Graham at one point during the main course, voice low and appreciative. "She's remarkable," he said. "Where have you been hiding her?" Graham smiled in the way he smiled at things he didn't know how to answer. "She doesn't like being hidden." Calloway laughed like that was the most charming thing he'd heard all year. By dessert, Abby was in a conversation with Calloway's associate, a man named Daniel Park, late 30s, Stanford MBA, the kind of easy confidence that came from never having had a reason to doubt himself. He was leaning toward her slightly, the way people lean toward warmth. He said something that made her laugh, and she touched her bracelet absently while she responded. and Daniel Park looked at her with the open, uncomplicated admiration of a man who has decided he wants to know someone better. Graham cut his dessert into a precise, unnecessary square and said nothing. In the car on the way home, the silence was different. It had weight. It had a specific shape. Abby looked out her window at the river lights sliding past, one hand in her lap, the gold bracelet catching the passing glow of street lamps. She looked. Graham searched for the word and found it before he could stop himself. Untouchable. Not cold. Not closed. Simply, completely, sovereignly herself, in a way that made the space between them feel less like distance and more like something he had created and was only now understanding the dimensions of. "Calloway liked you," he said. His voice came out even. "He's lovely," she said, still looking at the window. A beat. "Daniel Park asked for your card," Graham said. It wasn't a question. He had seen it happen. The brief exchange, Abby producing her firm's card from her clutch with a professional smile, Daniel sliding it into his jacket pocket like something valuable. Abby turned from the window and looked at him. Her expression was pleasant, open, giving him absolutely nothing. "Networking," she said simply. She turned back to the window. Graham faced forward. The city moved past the windshield in streaks of gold and white, and he kept his hands very still on his thighs and said nothing for the remainder of the drive. But something was happening behind his composure, something he couldn't contain with the usual architecture of distance and control. It wasn't about Daniel Park. He understood that clearly enough to find it inconvenient. Daniel Park was simply the mirror that had shown Graham something he had been successfully avoiding. The way he had watched her all evening, the way his jaw had tightened when another man leaned toward her warmth, the way he had looked for her eyes in that room all night and found them everywhere except on him. He didn't have a clean category for what that was, but it sat in his chest the entire ride home, persistent and inconvenient, refusing to be filed.
Chapter 6.
Daniel Park sent flowers on a Tuesday, not to the apartment, to her firm, a clean architectural arrangement of white ranunculus and eucalyptus in a matte ceramic vase, the kind of thing chosen by someone who had done their research. The card said simply, "Wonderful to meet you." DP Abby set the vase on the corner of her desk, texted Meyer a photograph with zero commentary, and went back to the Whitmore project. She didn't mention it to Graham. He found out on Thursday, the way he found out most things, through channels that had nothing to do with her. A passing comment from Calloway during a call, something about Daniel mentioning he'd reached out to Graham's wife, said with the casual innocence of a man who had no idea he was dropping a stone into still water. Graham finished the call, set his phone face down on his desk, and sat for a moment in his office chair, looking at nothing in particular, while something moved through him that he had no architectural framework to contain. He told himself it was inconvenient, a complication in the margins of a plan that was already performing below projection. Daniel Park was a professional contact with transparent intentions, and Abby she was a variable. She had always been a variable. He repeated that to himself with less conviction than he would have liked. That evening he came home earlier than usual. Abby was at the kitchen island, laptop open, takeout containers arranged with the casual efficiency of someone who had decided dinner was a logistical problem rather than an event. She was in a grey, oversized sweater that had slipped off one shoulder, her hair loose, reading glasses he hadn't seen before perched on her nose. She looked entirely at home in a way that made the apartment feel, briefly and disarmingly, like somewhere someone actually lived. She glanced up when he walked in. "There's extra in the containers if you haven't eaten." "I'm fine," he said. He changed out of his suit, came back, poured himself water and stood at the counter. She had returned to her laptop. The only sounds were the soft click of her keyboard and the ambient hum of the city beyond the windows. "Daniel Park sent flowers to your office," he said. The typing stopped, just for a beat, a single deliberate pause, before resuming. She said. Graham set his glass down. "That's all you have to say." She looked up then, over the top of her reading glasses, with an expression of polite, faintly puzzled attention, like a professor who has been asked a question that is slightly beneath the level of the course. "What would you like me to say?" she asked. "That you're not entertaining it." The words landed in the room and immediately revealed more than he had intended them to. He knew it before he finished saying them. He watched her register it too, the slight shift in her expression, something moving behind her eyes that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite satisfaction. "He sent flowers to my office," she said carefully. "It was professional and considerate. I didn't send any back." She paused. "Is there a concern I should know about?" She was doing it again. That surgical courtesy, that perfectly calibrated composure that left him no surface to push against. He had nothing to hold on to. Every response she gave him was correct and complete, and told him absolutely nothing about what was happening beneath it. "No concern," he said. She nodded once and returned to her screen. He took his water to the living room, sat in the chair by the window, and looked out at the city. The lights of Chicago blurred slightly at the edges. He hadn't slept well in days, a fact he attributed to work and refused to examine further. But in the silence of the apartment, with the soft sound of her keyboard drifting from the kitchen and the warm lamplight spilling across the floor between them, something became very difficult to continue ignoring. He had not once, in all the years of building this plan, considered what it would feel like to watch someone else want her attention. He had not considered it because she had not been real to him yet. She had been a name, a function, a clean solution to a long-held problem. And then she had moved into his apartment and made dinner from a restaurant they had visited together and asked him about his childhood with those clear, patient eyes. And somewhere in the space between then and now, without his permission and without any warning, she had become extraordinarily, inconveniently real. The realization arrived not with drama, but with the quiet devastation of something that had been true for a while, before he was willing to look at it directly. He was jealous, not in the wounded pride way of a man whose possession has been noticed by another, but in the raw, unmanageable way of someone who understands suddenly and too clearly that what he stands to lose is not a variable. It was never a variable. He just hadn't known that yet when it mattered. He sat by the window for a long time. Behind him, her keyboard kept its quiet rhythm, steady and unbothered, completely indifferent to the fact that 6 feet away, the architecture of everything he thought he understood about himself was developing a crack it would not recover from.
Chapter 7.
The snow started on a Friday evening and didn't stop. By Saturday morning, Chicago had gone quiet in the particular way that only happens under heavy snowfall, a hush that settles over the city like a held breath, muffling the traffic and the sirens and the relentless forward motion of a place that never fully sleeps. The skyline outside their windows had softened at the edges, the hard geometry of steel and glass dissolved into something gentler, and the world beyond the apartment had reduced itself to white. They were not going anywhere. Abby discovered this at 7:15 when she checked her phone and found 3 cancelled notifications: a brunch with Maya, her afternoon visit to a client site, a dinner reservation she had made largely to have somewhere to be that wasn't here. Graham appeared in the kitchen 20 minutes later, looked at his own phone with the expression of a man recalibrating, poured his coffee, and said nothing. By 10 o'clock, the silence had become its own presence in the room. Abby sat up at the dining table with her sketchpad and a project brief, working in the focused, unhurried way she did on weekends when no one was watching. Graham was on the sofa with his laptop, doing whatever it was Graham did on Saturday mornings when the world hadn't cancelled itself outside his windows. They occupied the apartment like 2 planets in separate orbits, aware of each other's gravity, maintaining careful distance. It lasted until early afternoon, when the heating made the apartment warm and close and the snow kept falling, and Abby made soup because it was that kind of day, and the smell of it moved through the apartment, and apparently Graham Cole was not immune to the smell of soup. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. "That smells good," he said. "Sit down," she said, not unkind, just matter of fact, the way you speak to someone when the weather has temporarily suspended the usual rules of engagement. He sat at the island. She put a bowl in front of him. They ate in silence for a while, and it was strange, not uncomfortable, just strange, the way unfamiliar things are strange before they become familiar. "Did you always live in Chicago?" she asked. Not a probe, just conversation, the kind the snow seemed to be insisting on. "I moved here for university," he said. "Stayed." "Where were you before?" A pause, shorter than the ones she'd learned to expect. "Boston, my father's house." She looked at her bowl. "Was it a good house?" Something shifted in the quality of his silence. She felt it without looking up, a change in the air, subtle and significant. It was a precise house, he said finally. She looked up then. He was looking at his soup, one hand around the bowl, and there was something in the set of his jaw that was different from his usual composure. Not cracked, but honest, in a way that composure usually isn't. My mother left when I was 11, he said. It came out quietly, without preamble, like something that had been standing near a door for a long time, and finally walked through it. My father decided that feelings were inefficient after that, so we didn't have them. We had schedules, expectations, results. Abby set her spoon down. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned, somewhere in these weeks of living alongside him, that Graham's silences needed room, not rescue. That must have been lonely, she said. He looked at her, direct and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. Not the intense opacity of the man at the altar, not the controlled attention of client dinners, but something underneath all of that. Something that looked, for just a moment, like someone who had been alone in a precise house for a very long time. It was efficient, he said. That's not what I asked. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, and genuine, which made it more significant than anything more polished would have been. They stayed at the island for 2 more hours. She told him about growing up in her father's orbit, the business dinners she attended at 14, learning to read a room before she learned to drive, the particular exhaustion of being Richard Hartwell's daughter in rooms full of people who wanted something from Richard Hartwell. He listened the way she had watched him listen to Calloway and Daniel Park and every other person who had ever been worth his attention. Completely, without interruption, with those dark eyes that held yours and didn't let go. And he asked questions, real ones, not the careful social calibrations of their first weeks, questions that required her to think. That suggested he was actually interested in the answer, rather than the performance of interest. Outside, the snow kept falling. The city stayed quiet. The apartment, warm and lamplit and smelling of soup, felt for the first time like somewhere 2 people actually were, rather than 2 people performing the choreography of being somewhere together. At some point he refilled her tea without being asked. His hand was close to hers on the counter when he set the mug down, and neither of them moved away. He turned to say something. She could see it forming. Something real, something that had been building for weeks behind those dark, careful eyes. The words didn't come. He looked at her for a long moment instead. The kind of look that says everything the mouth refuses to. And then looked away. But the temperature between them had changed, and this time they both knew it.
Chapter 8.
The call came on a Wednesday morning. Graham was in his office at Cole Equity when his father's name appeared on his phone screen, an event rare enough to make him set down his coffee and close the door before answering. Edward Cole did not call without reason. He was, as he had always been, a man who considered communication a transaction and kept his transactions brief and purposeful. "I need to see you," his father said. No greeting. "Tonight. The house." Graham arrived at 7. The house in Lincoln Park was the same as it had always been, tall, dark-bricked, immaculate, the kind of house that had never once looked like children had lived in it, even when they had. Edward Cole was in the study, standing at the window with a glass of scotch, still wearing his work clothes at 7 in the evening, because Edward Cole did not own casual clothes in any meaningful sense. He turned when Graham entered. And something in his father's face, something Graham had never seen there before, a looseness around the jaw, a heaviness in the eyes, made him stop just inside the doorway. "Sit down," his father said. Graham sat. What followed was 23 minutes that rearranged everything. His father spoke slowly, with the particular difficulty of a man who had spent 40 years building a wall and was now, brick by brick, taking it apart with his own hands. He spoke about Graham's mother, about the year before she left, about a business decision that had gone wrong and a partnership dissolving, and the way Edward Cole had handled all of it, with silence, with withdrawal, with the precise and devastating emotional unavailability that had defined him his entire life. He spoke about Richard Hartwell, about the deal that had collapsed, the accusation his father had carried for decades, that Hartwell had deliberately undermined the Cole family's position, had fed false information to their investors, had orchestrated the professional destruction that had defined the trajectory of everything that came after. And then, with the scotch glass turning slowly in his hands and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past Graham's shoulder. He said the thing that dismantled 20 years of architecture in under 60 seconds. "I was wrong about him," Edward Cole said. "I found the original correspondence last month going through your mother's things." A pause, weighted and enormous. "Hartwell tried to warn me. He sent 3 letters. I never opened them. I was too angry, too proud, too certain I already knew what they said." His jaw tightened. "The betrayal I told you about, the one I built everything around telling you about, it never happened. It was my own silence that destroyed us, not his." The study was very quiet. Graham sat completely still. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that felt clinical, steady, mechanical, the sound of a system continuing to function while everything it had been built to support was no longer there. It never happened. He thought about the plan, the years of it, the careful construction, the patience, the cold and elegant architecture of a revenge built on a foundation he had never once thought to inspect because his father had laid it. And his father was certain, and certainty had been the only inheritance Edward Cole knew how to give. He thought about Abby. He stood up before his father finished speaking and drove back to the apartment with both hands on the wheel and the city moving past him like something from another life. She was in the living room when he walked in, curled on the sofa with a book, wearing the grey sweater, reading glasses on. She looked up when the door opened, and something in the way she looked at him, a careful, complete stillness, the kind that belongs to someone who already knows, told him everything before he said a word. She knew. He didn't know how long she had known. He didn't know what she had done with the knowing, how she had carried it through dinners and snowstorms and conversations over soup, while he remained oblivious to the fact that the woman he had married as a weapon had been living with the wound of it since the beginning. "Abby," he said. Her name in his mouth had a different weight than it used to. It had gravity now, consequence. She closed her book. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the cushion beside her. She looked at him with those clear, composed eyes and said nothing, giving him the room she had always given him, the space to find his own words without rescue. He opened his mouth. Everything he had prepared in the car, the explanations, the context, the carefully constructed sentences, dissolved completely. What came out was just, "I'm sorry." 2 words. Inadequate. True. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he felt every second of it, every centimetre of the distance between who he had been when this started and who he was standing in this room being now. Then she stood. She picked up her reading glasses. She walked past him toward the hallway, and the faint scent of her perfume moved through the air between them, warm and familiar, the smell of everything he had not allowed himself to want until it was already too late. She stopped in the doorway. "I know," she said quietly, and then she was gone.
Chapter 9.
She packed on a Thursday morning while Graham was at the office. Not because she was hiding from him. She had nothing left to hide from, and hiding had never been her way. She packed on a Thursday morning because she had made her decision with a clear head on a clear day, and she wanted to honor that clarity by carrying it out in the same spirit. No dramatics, no performance. Just a woman choosing herself with the same quiet conviction she had brought to everything else in her life that had ever truly mattered. Maya had offered her the guest room 2 days earlier, in the way Maya offered things, without fanfare, without a single unnecessary word, just a text that said, "Room is ready when you are," and a key left under the mat. Abby pulled 2 suitcases from the closet and began. She was methodical about it. Her clothes, her books, the small ceramic bowl her mother had given her that sat on the bathroom shelf, the sketchpad stacked beside the dining table, the project briefs, the good coffee she had bought because Graham's was too bitter and she had never said so. Small things, the accumulated texture of a life that had been, however briefly and however falsely premised, genuinely hers. She did not take the things they had acquired together. The throw blanket they had bought at a market on a cold October Saturday, 2 weeks before the wedding, when the plan was already in motion and she hadn't known. The coffee table book about Chicago architecture she had given him as a gesture toward closeness, and he had actually read, leaving it with a bookmark 2/3 of the way through. Those things belonged to a story she was no longer writing. She moved through the apartment with the focused calm of someone who had already done the grieving. She had done it in the bathroom that first night on the cold marble floor, with her back against the wall. She had done it quietly and privately and completely, the way she did most things. By the time Thursday morning arrived, she was not sad in the way that requires an audience. She was sad in the way of someone who understands that some losses are also, in the same breath, a form of grace. She was in the bedroom folding a sweater when she became aware of him in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. He was early, hours early, and he stood at the threshold in his coat, as though he hadn't decided yet whether entering was something he had the right to do. She looked at him. He looked at the suitcases. Something moved across his face, a progression of things, arriving and passing too quickly to name individually, leaving behind an expression she had never seen on him before, open, undefended, the face of a man standing at the edge of something vast with no plan for what comes next. "You're leaving," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. She went back to folding. Not because she was indifferent to him. She understood now with a clarity that was its own kind of ache, that she was very far from indifferent to him, but because the act of folding the sweater was honest, and honest was the only register she had left. Abby. Her name in his voice had changed again, lower now, stripped of the last of its composure, carrying something raw and unpolished that she felt in her sternum. She stopped. She held the folded sweater against her chest and looked at him. "I'm not leaving because I hate you," she said. "I want you to know that." His jaw tightened. He looked like a man trying to hold something together with the wrong tools. "Then stay," he said. "I can't stay in something that was built on a lie." Her voice was steady. She had earned that steadiness. "Not because I'm not capable of forgiveness. I think I am, eventually. But because I deserve to be chosen, Graham. Actually chosen. Not positioned." She paused. "And you deserve to figure out what that even means for you, without me standing here making it easier to avoid." He said nothing. But his eyes, those dark, careful eyes that had kept their distance from her for months, were doing something she had never seen them do before. They were simply looking at her. No strategy, no architecture, no controlled opacity. Just looking, the way you look at something you are only now understanding you cannot afford to lose. She zipped the suitcase. The sound of it was very final in the quiet apartment. She carried it to the entryway, came back for the second one, and Graham stepped aside to let her pass with the particular care of a man who is respecting something, even though it is costing him more than he expected. At the door, she stopped. She turned back once. He was standing in the middle of the living room, coat still on, hands at his sides, the Chicago skyline framing him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, like a photograph of a man standing in the exact moment his life divided itself into before and after. "Take care of yourself," she said. She meant it. That was the thing about Abby Hartwell. She always meant what she said. The door closed behind her with a soft, decisive click. And in the silence that followed, Graham Cole stood completely still, while the apartment filled with the specific, devastating absence of someone who had been real all along.
Chapter 10.
He found her on a Saturday 3 weeks later, not through strategy, not through the careful, methodical information gathering that had defined every significant move of his adult life. He found her because he had spent 21 days learning what it felt like to exist in rooms she no longer occupied, and on the 22nd day, he simply could not make a reasonable argument for continuing to do that. Maya had not made it easy. When he called, she was quiet for a long moment and then said with the particular precision of a woman who had watched her best friend pack 2 suitcases on a Thursday morning, "If you're going to find her, Graham, you'd better be sure you know why." Then she told him where Abby was and hung up before he could thank her. She was at the Art Institute. He found her in the modern wing, standing in front of a large canvas, deep blues and fractured geometry, the kind of painting that asks more questions than it answers. She was in a camel coat, hair down, hands in her pockets, completely absorbed. Around her, the gallery moved at its unhurried weekend pace, soft footsteps, murmured observations, the particular quality of silence that exists in rooms full of people looking at beautiful things. He stood at the entrance to the room for a moment. Just looking at her. He had rehearsed nothing. For the first time in his adult life, he had arrived somewhere without a prepared position, without contingency planning, without the protective architecture of knowing exactly what he intended to say and precisely how he intended to say it. He had driven here with the radio off and his hands on the wheel and nothing in his chest, except the specific gravity of someone moving toward the only thing that still made sense. She became aware of him the way she always became aware of things, quietly, completely, without performance. She turned her head, saw him, and went very still. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that he could see the slight adjustment in her breathing, the careful composure she assembled around herself, like something she had learned to wear well. "I'm not here to explain myself," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "You already know everything there is to explain, and you were right to leave. I need you to know that I understand that, not as something I'm saying to get a particular response, but because it's true, and you deserve to hear it plainly." She watched him, those clear, patient eyes giving him nothing, offering him the same room she had always offered, the space to find his own words, to arrive at his own honesty without rescue. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a small envelope. Plain white, her name written on the front in his handwriting, precise as everything about him was precise, but somehow softer than she remembered it. She didn't take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him. "What is this?" she asked. "It's a letter," he said. "Everything I should have said in that living room and didn't have the language for yet." A pause. "I've had 3 weeks to find the language." She took the envelope. She held it in both hands without opening it, looking at him with an expression he was only now finally able to read. Not the surgical composure she had worn through their marriage like armor, but something underneath it. Something that had been there all along, careful and real and quietly waiting to see if he would ever become someone worth showing it to. He did something then that he had not planned and could not have explained analytically. He dropped to one knee, not with a ring, not with a speech, with nothing except the specific, undefended honesty of a man who had spent his entire life standing at a distance from everything that mattered and had finally, at significant cost, understood why that had to stop. "I'm not asking you to forgive what I did," he said. "I'm not asking you to forget it or minimize it or pretend it didn't happen. I'm asking for something harder than that." He looked up at her. "I'm asking you to let me start over. Not the version of me that married you for the wrong reasons, but this version, the one that spent 3 weeks in a silent apartment learning that every room in it had your fingerprints on it and that I put them there by being someone worth staying around long enough to leave a mark." The gallery was quiet around them. Someone somewhere in an adjacent room laughed softly. Light came through the high windows and landed on the marble floor in long, pale rectangles. Abby looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt every second of it, not with anxiety, not with the calculated patience of a man waiting for an outcome, but with the open, unguarded stillness of someone who has nothing left to protect and has discovered, surprisingly, that this feels like freedom. Then something shifted in her face. Not a wall coming down. The wall had been hers to keep or remove, and she had earned every brick of it, but a door opening slightly, just enough to let the light through. "You're going to have to start from zero," she said. Her voice was quiet and even and entirely her own. No shortcuts, no strategies, just you being honest, every single day. He looked up at her, and for the first time since he had slid a ring onto her finger on a Chicago rooftop and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of a plan in motion, he smiled. Not the polished social smile, not the controlled half-curve of a man managing an impression. A real smile, arriving without permission, belonging entirely to this moment and no other. "Tell me where to begin," he said. Abby looked at him for one more long, luminous moment, and then, slowly, she extended her hand. She walked down that aisle believing in love, and she was right to. She just didn't know yet that love wasn't waiting at the altar. It was waiting on the other side of the hardest thing she would ever survive. Graham built a plan to destroy her and ended up being undone by her instead. Not by her anger, but by her dignity. Some people enter our lives as wounds. A few, if we're brave enough to stay present, become the reason we finally heal. Was it fate, or just two broken people choosing at the last possible moment to be honest? If this story moved you, subscribe, leave your like, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence here is what keeps these stories alive.
Thank you for listening with me. I'm Marcus Hale, and I'll see you in the next story.